Who was, or perhaps is, Jeffrey Edward Epstein? That question was at the heart of me starting this entire deep dive just before his arrest back in 2019, and it remains a salient theme behind the questions that I've tried my best to lay out and answer with this series. The honest truth is, despite all these years of research and investigation, and despite my months of writing and fact-checking, I'm not 100% sure that I nor anyone else that's willing to speak out on the topic at least, are capable of definitively and conclusively, fully answering that question. In this series, I feel that I have painted a solid picture of a lot of his life and his deeds, and particularly in this final episode, I've exposed a great deal of the darkest elements of his network's existence and operations. But is it the whole truth? Everywhere I looked in this case, I found more rabbit holes. Some led to more corruption within our system. Some led to the involvement of the global predatory, or as forever be known and forever called them, the Epstein class, and the vast and interconnected networks that they represent. Some, actually most of those rabbit holes just led to more, even deeper rabbit holes, and still many simply led to dead ends. Not because nothing was ever there, at least not in the majority of them, but because the hard evidence, what could actually prove these suspicions beyond a shadow of a doubt, are overly redacted or were just never even released to us. As many documents as I poured over since their release last year, there's an equal amount more that were not released in violation of the law and that we simply don't have. And this all causes a remarkable amount of them to show us just enough to know that something deeper and often far darker exists, but they all seem to stop just short of the rest of the documents that would be needed to fully expose it or in any way to actually have actionable evidence for prosecution. That being said, there is ample evidence of intel connections, co-conspirators, tons of additional victims, and the very obvious takeaway that his 2008 sweetheart deal had no justifiable reason to have ever happened. The only reasonable answer for how it did is that people with a great deal of power needed him to be back on the outside as quickly as possible, and with as little disruption to his network as could possibly be. In this episode, I intend to explore all of those anomalous elements and much more. Everything has been building to this moment. In the research folder for this series, which dropped last night in the Discord and Patreon chats, totally free, you'll find many of the most pertinent documents in there, including the fully unredacted address book and flight logs, the ones that were made available by former House Manager Alfredo Rodriguez through our old friend Nick Bryant, the journalist behind the Franklin Scandal book that we discussed in the Franklin Cover-Up series. I doubt that I even need to say this, but just in case, please don't call these numbers or otherwise reach out to anyone that's in that black book. Most of those numbers were changed years ago anyway. It is being provided as a reference because we will be digging into it later in this episode. It's perhaps worth noting that from everything that I've seen and read, Epstein's little black book was equally, if not more so, Ghislaine Maxwell's. She was, without a doubt, his inroad to many of the elite circles that he was able to infiltrate. We know about all of that though, right? That reporting has been out there, scattered, but available for anyone curious enough and willing to do some legwork to put the facts together. That isn't really what this episode is about. This is about all of the details that seem to conveniently fall through the cracks of mainstream reporting. The details that change elements of the story that we've already discussed into something that tells a bigger story. It's not about the details that he chose to be known, or the little tidbits just beneath, the ones that leave us with more questions than they ever provided in answers. It's about the parts of this story that not only Epstein and his cohorts worked so hard to obfuscate and bury, but so did the FBI, CIA, DOJ, and even, yes, our current president. The parts that actually frighten even the scientific community. Not just because he purchased a sort of false legitimacy from them, but because of the horrors that would go way beyond abuse that some of them were privy to, and even more discussed amongst themselves when they thought that no one was listening. There is a sizable portion of what we will be discussing tonight that won't pop up in a Google search. Details that I've personally uncovered in the course of this investigation that will challenge the official narrative. But what I can promise you is that I will make it crystal clear what is verified, what is supported by preponderance of the evidence, and what I feel could be reasonably inferred through victim interviews, witness statements, and other sources. What I will not do, which by now I hope that you've come to trust me with, is bring you wild speculation without supporting evidence or for the sake of fitting things neatly into a preconceived narrative. I do have a short warning up front here, and it is more important than ever that I say it. We will be discussing topics tonight that some listeners may find uncomfortable or could potentially trigger trauma memories within them. A few of those topics are suicide, sexual abuse, murder, and human trafficking, also abortion, and illegal and unethical medical experimentation. If you feel that hearing about those things or similar topics may cause you any undue mental anguish, or could have a lasting negative effect on your overall mental health, this may not be the episode for you. I will do my best, as always, to minimize the more graphic material or anything that isn't necessary to properly convey these events and the accusations. But I want to make everyone aware right up front that these topics will be broached, and I encourage everyone to take any precautions that they feel may be needed. Now, with all of that out of the way, welcome to File002, Epstein, The Reckoning, Part 4, Case Closed.
Welcome to Clandestine Radio Podcast, Season 4.
I don't know, I guess I just had the ambition to talk to people this year, bring back the interview format. I also still try to do several deep dives and cover some topics that I've really been wanting to get to and never had a chance to. And I guess just hope that everybody's willing to come along for the ride. Chapter 15. No Clean Escape. For years, she was one of the most important witnesses in the Epstein case. She stood up to billionaires, she confronted and exposed royalty, and she played a major role in exposing a trafficking operation that reached into the highest and most protected levels of global power. And on April 25th of 2025, she would pay for it with her life, becoming the third notable accuser to die under suspicious circumstances since 2017. Born Virginia Lee Roberts on August 9th of 1983 in Sacramento, California, her entire life had been one long series of abuse and bad circumstances. 18 days ago, she had been in a highly suspicious accident involving a school bus. While the accident report would describe the crash as minor, but not before initially stating that they had no records of any such a crash, ABC News would later report that a vehicle was actually hit by a school bus in the rural areas of Western Australia, but the police characterized it as minor, and the hospital that she was taken to listed her condition as stable. When Virginia posted about the crash on Instagram, she described it as being so severe that her car, quote, might as well be a tin can. She would also state how, quote, this year has been the worst start to a new year, but I won't bore anyone with the details. But I think it is important to note that when a school bus driver comes at you driving 110 kilometers, as we were slowing down for a turn, that no matter what your car is made of, it might as well be a tin can. It would be accompanied by a photo showing her receiving medical care with a badly bruised face in a hospital bed, with an EKG lead sticker on her chest. The post would go on to claim that she was, quote, given days to live as she had gone into renal failure, and she just wanted to, quote, see her babies one last time. Immediately, questions would pop up that would cast doubt over her account. The crash had occurred on March 24th. Virginia's post would be made on the 30th. When questions would begin coming from all directions, her family would issue a statement. To summarize it, they said that she was grateful for the outpouring of love and support, that she remains in serious condition and was receiving medical care, that she's been banged up and bruised and went home initially, but her condition apparently worsened and she was later admitted to the hospital. Then they made the statement, quote, concerning her Instagram post, Virginia thought that she had posted on her private Facebook page. Virginia and her family thank everyone for their concern. There was a major discrepancy between what the police, bus driver, and witnesses described and what Virginia was claiming happened. On the surface, it appeared to many that Virginia was exaggerating the damage from the crash, and for some reason, being deceptive. Most media seemed content with that narrative and they ran with it. Then, a few days later, on April 5th, People magazine would release an investigative report featuring statements from Virginia and her brother Sky, revealing that, or at least claiming, sorry for legal reasons, that her husband, Robert Giuffre, had been physically abusive to her for the better part of their 22-year marriage. The article would include this quote from her, quote, I was able to fight back against Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein, who abused and trafficked me, but I was unable to escape the domestic violence in my own marriage until recently. After my husband's latest physical assault, I can no longer stay silent. She would end by saying, quote, "Again, I thank everyone for their support. I have faith justice will prevail." A spokesperson for Virginia Giuffre would confirm that Virginia had reported on January 9th of 2025 assault that had taken place in Dunsborough, West Australia, to the police, who didn't charge Robert with any crime. Her sister-in-law would tell People magazine that, quote, "I think the last incident that they had, she almost died," referring to the January 9th incident. Virginia would separate from Robert around August of 2023, and it was during a trip to celebrate one of the children's birthdays in January that she was allegedly beat so severely that she was left hospitalized with a cracked sternum and perforated eye, among other injuries. Given that info, I would theorize that her injuries were the result of that incident and not the accident with the bus. Her post still doesn't make total sense, even then, but it makes it at least a bit more likely that it may have been used to try and explain away her injuries and ongoing health issues, and possibly her first attempt at working up the courage to go public about the abuse. All that can be said for sure is that 20 days later, on the morning of April 25th, police would respond to her residence in Neargaby on what has been cited as a welfare check, and would find her unresponsive. She would be declared dead at the scene. While major crimes detectives would initially open up an inquiry, from the very start they were already stating that nothing suggested foul play. They would reportedly prepare material for the coroner, but deferred to the coroner's office for a formal determination in the matter, stating that the official cause of death would have to come from the report of the coroner's ultimate findings. That was over a year ago now, and as of mid-May 2026, there has yet to be any release of their findings, and the coroner's court has given no timetable for its completion either. While I can't say for sure, we may have gotten a peek behind the curtain of silence with the DOJ's final release of the Epstein files, albeit only briefly. Sitting within the latest release were several private emails, which raise a few questions on its own, that were briefly made public before falling victim to the major redaction and document pool that took place before they became available for download. Among them, according to reporting done by the Daily Mail, were several very personal emails from fellow Epstein survivor Maria Farmer, including one that she had sent to several of Virginia's attorneys, which contained the line, quote, "She died from self-inflicted gunshot wound last week at her home in Australia," before going on to express her disbelief and grief over the news. Maybe it's just me and cynicism, but whenever someone who was important to ongoing litigation against powerful entities about to publish memoirs or otherwise inconvenient for the official narrative, or those peddling it, dies by a gunshot wound or timely overdose, it triggers my suspicion and engages my pattern recognition. While some of her family reportedly put out statements referencing her death as a suicide, which the media ran with instantly, her father would quickly refute it and express doubt, even telling Piers Morgan in an interview, quote, "There's no way she did that," and would add, quote, "Somebody got to her." And while we simply don't have enough of the information to make a solid determination, if you consider her ongoing custody battle that had already turned violent on at least one significant occasion, her ongoing role with victims' rights, and still being a potential star witness for any future charges against Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, Ghislaine Maxwell, or even any of the other co-conspirators that might be named, with enough pressure in the future, her father's doubts, which are heartfelt opinions, but carry little weight on their own. However, all of it together, to me personally, is at least worth further scrutiny, especially once you realize that hers is far from the only strange death surrounding Epstein and his network, and is only one of 3 known vocal victims to meet with an early or unusual death. There's a pattern in the Epstein story that keeps repeating. It's much the same as it was in Franklin and so many other cases like them. Girls are drawn in when they are young and easier to manipulate, abused while they are vulnerable, and then years later we are left to explain what happened to them, long after the headlines move on. In this chapter, I want to introduce you to 2 women who fit that pattern in a way that is hard to ignore. Carolyn Andriano and Lee Sky Patrick. Both spoke out about Epstein abusing them. Both suffered for it, and ultimately both of them would be found dead in hotel rooms in West Palm Beach of suspected drug overdoses. The media narratives made them sound simple and clear-cut. Tragic, sure, but something expected from the all-too-common progression of early abuse, instability, unhealthy trauma and coping responses, and the inevitable downhill slide from drug abuse to numb the lifelong pain into accidental overdose. Just more of the many victims' lives who were irreparably damaged or destroyed by Epstein's abuse and trafficking. Contemporary reporting largely just glossed over their deaths. much in the same way that happened retrospectively with Virginia's death. Just another one of his victims for who the burden it placed over their lives had simply added up and proved to be too much. Just one more tragic loss in a string of deaths only connected by their earlier abuse. Seemingly, no one in the mainstream press ever stopped to even note how quote-unquote accidental overdoses seem to happen a lot around powerful people to their inconvenient victims or people who may know just a little too much. Lee Sky Patrick was invited to Epstein's Palm Beach mansion as a teenager by Ghislaine Maxwell, with promises of money, travel, stability, and modeling opportunity. The same sort of lure that appears in so many grooming and abuse cases. According to later reporting, she was 16 when she first went there, in 2004. She didn't find any of those more glamorous sounding pieces of bait. Just Epstein in a towel, and the same coercive imbalance, the same ultimate pitch that her body could be exchanged for cash and promises of more. She would become one of Epstein's earliest accusers. According to her sister, Shelby, Sky, as most knew her, told her that Epstein, quote, scared the life out of me, and that she was deeply shocked by Epstein's abuse, and that abuse derailed her life. The paper trail is much thinner for her than the more well-known accusers, but in fact, what stood out to me the most about her, aside from her tragic death, was just how little of her later adult life is publicly documented. She underscores how cases like hers only become visible at the moments of death, leaving the years in between blurred, often by dropping out of the public eye, or even society in general, and far too often swallowed up by the addiction and poverty that overtake their lives once an abuser has tossed them aside, and inadequate victim support structures, what little do exist, have allowed them to slip between the cracks, especially once their usefulness to the legal system has run its course. As for Carolyn Antriano, another underage victim, she was actually recruited by Virginia Giuffre, and it was Carolyn's testimony that was pivotal in putting Ghislaine in prison at her trial. While she didn't use her name, or at least her last name, during the trial for fear of retaliation, she would choose to reveal it once the trial was over, just to try and help empower other victims to come forward. She would be quoted in a January 2022 interview with the Daily Mail as saying, quote, "I'm not ashamed at being a victim of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell." She would also add, quote, "For other girls that have been victimized, I want them to know that it is okay to come out and tell somebody, even if you don't want to be identified. And the sooner the better." She was also a vocal advocate for victims' rights. Carolyn met Epstein at just 14 and was abused for the next 4 years. Presumably, she lost her value to him and his trafficking network once she actually reached legal age. The trauma she suffered during this time would soon lead to her life spiraling. During her testimony in the Maxwell criminal trial, she would state that during those years from 14 to 18, she would begin using pain pills, weed, and cocaine, adding, quote, "anything that could black out for me to go to the appointment." Speaking of the massage and abuse appointments that would be scheduled for her up to 3 times a week by Maxwell and later by Sarah Kellen, who we will discuss in just a bit. Maxwell, who was well aware of her age, 14 at this point, would invite her to go with her and Epstein to the island, and would also come into the bedroom where the massages were set up while Caroline was nude, and grab her breasts and buttocks, allegedly commenting, quote, that Caroline had a great body for Mr. Epstein and his friends. Sarah Kellen would also call her, and she would state that she could be paid $500 to $600 if she could take photos of her for Mr. Epstein. Epstein would also mail lingerie to her house for her. Again, this was a 14-year-old girl, and of course it was from Les Wexner's Victoria's Secret brand. Epstein would also ask her to bring friends that were your age or younger over to be paid for the same massage/abuse pyramid scheme that we spoke of previously. And she would bring 3 girls over the course of her going there. She would be paid an extra amount for bringing them, citing one example where she was paid $600 and her friend was paid the usual $300. After she quote-unquote aged out of going there, basically she was already addicted to the drugs that she was using to cope and would fight addiction for the most of her life after that. At the time of her death, she had seemingly found some stability and was with her husband and at least her 3 younger children when her death would take place. According to her mother, she had finally reached a point where she was, quote, turning her whole life around, and her mother was vocal about doubting the official story about her death. Other family would disagree with her, though. Carolyn's death is a bit of an odd one, though. I'm not claiming that it was foul play, but definitely unusual. Her husband, John Pitts, and 3 younger children were staying at the DoubleTree by Hilton in West Palm Beach, and they all went to bed around the same time. That night, she hadn't seemed inebriated. Her husband thought that she might be sick, But not much else was thought about it, and they all laid down to go to sleep. And when John rolled over in the morning, Carolyn was now fully naked and unresponsive. Police would report finding a crack pipe, a baggie with a white powder residue in it, and a needle in her purse. A later toxicology report would find a mix of methadone, fentanyl, and Xanax in her system, but no cocaine. Vodka bottles were also found in the room, but no alcohol was found, or reported at least, to be in her system either. It may be worth noting that methadone has an extremely high affinity for binding and filling up the opioid receptors of the brain, meaning that taking any other opioids won't really matter because the user won't exactly feel the desired high from them anyway, but it does still greatly increase the likelihood of overdose, which is stressed to any patient that starts that treatment. Something that she would have been very well aware of, having been on it for several years at this point. Whatever the true cause of these deaths were, the outcome was the same. 3 vocal accusers, 2 with direct roles in exposing co-conspirators, were silenced forever, and they're far from the only ones. One of these deaths that is often overlooked is that of Alfred Paul Seckel. Al was, as he was better known, began dating and apparently married Ghislaine's sister Isabel around 2007, and despite never divorcing his previous wife, when Epstein began planning his big return from prison in 2009, he began working with Al as one of his first scientific authentication layers. On November 6 of 2010, Epstein and Seckel would announce something called the Mindshift Conference on St. Thomas and Little St. James, which would pull together Nobel Prize winners, laureates, MIT professors, and leading minds in various fields. You may be wondering who Seckel is. That is actually a very good question that no one really seems to have a complete answer for. According to him, he was an Ivy League graduate, doctoral candidate at Caltech. Neither were true. He claimed to have the largest private collection of optical illusions, which I'm certain was also even debatable. He was a collector and seller of rare books, but left many a fraud in his wake, and more than one lawsuit. So, from everything that I can find on the guy, he seems to mostly have been a master bullshit artist, able to weasel his way in with actual intellectuals, and above all, a con man. There are many accounts about the why, and I would rather not speculate, but sometime around 2010, he and Isabel Maxwell moved to France. In 2015, he would vanish. Many believe that he faked his death to escape whatever legal or financial stresses had possibly driven him there to begin with. All that was known was that a car that he had rented was found in a parking lot in a town that is now my inner 15-year-old's favorite one to say, sans cercle la poupée, unlocked with the keys in the ignition. For years, the majority of the world and journalists who had reached out about the death records had come up empty. All suspected that he faked his death. 7 years later, the Daily Mail would finally obtain a death certificate and break the story that he had apparently walked 2 miles, as a very heavy-set and out-of-shape older man, to throw himself off of a 100-foot cliff, having had to walk past several even higher and shorter cliffs to get there to begin with. They also say that his body was actually found just a few weeks after he went missing, and was severely decayed and missing a hand and a foot. To be crystal clear, any claims that his death was connected to Epstein is speculative, but you will hear it out there. I'm really only bringing him up because he was yet another unusual death tied to the Epstein-Maxwell circle. There's a pattern emerging, but not the one that I expected. By now, though, you probably know my approach. I don't bend or exaggerate the evidence to fit my narrative. I follow it wherever it leads to. So let's look at a few others. I'm sure you recall Epstein's Ponzi scheme, Fall Guy, Stephen Hoffenberg. Shortly before his death, Hoffenberg would grant an interview to a tabloid magazine, and would claim in this interview that a shadowy group had tasked Epstein and Maxwell with ensnaring global leaders and elites within a vast blackmail scheme. He would tell the National Enquirer the following, quote, "Wherever Epstein was entertaining, he and Ghislaine were taping," adding, quote, "They were sending video footage to the cabal every week." He would also claim that the tapes would be, quote, "the motherlode of damning evidence which would take down many of the world's most powerful men and shatter the secret cabal that Epstein reported to." He also claimed the FBI and NYPD had the tape since the raids in 2019. Both he and Epstein whistleblower John Mark Dugan, formerly of the Palm Beach Sheriff's Department, have both insisted, as I think many of us suspected at this point, that the government buries evidence to protect Epstein's powerful friends. Prince Andrew, Bill Clinton, and Bill Gates are among the names that they mentioned. And according to Trump himself, releasing the files would hurt his friends as well. Then, just weeks later, on August 23rd of 2022, Police in Derby, Connecticut would be called to Hoffenberg's residence for a welfare check after a private investigator who had been working with a woman identified as an Epstein victim had reported not hearing from Steve for 5 days, which was highly unusual. After gaining entry into his apartment, police would discover Hoffenberg's body on the floor in an advanced state of decomposition. It would require dental records to positively ID his body. Despite the body's condition, following a tox screening and autopsy, it would be ruled as a natural death with no signs of foul play. His death was extremely convenient, however. This was about 2 months after the Maxwell trial and at a point where Hoffenberg had emerged from his reclusive isolation to publicly declare that he was planning to assist victims and reveal details about Epstein that only he claimed to know. Does that automatically mean something untoward was done to him? No, but it is a bit odd, so add it to the list. Oh, and he did tell the Inquirer to wait 3 years after his death to publish that interview, which they did. So the interview itself shouldn't be considered a factor, really, given what all these people were in various ways privy to when they unexpectedly turned up dead. The natural knee-jerk instinct for myself, and I'm sure many of you out there, was suspicion of something darker beneath the surface. And to be 100% real with you, I can't say for certain that there wasn't. I just also can't say, based on the available evidence in these cases, that there definitely was either. As intriguing as it would be, and better for the story I'm sure, to tell you that they were all bumped off and there's a grand conspiracy behind all of it, I can't prove that. And while there are plenty of creators out there who are more than happy to make salacious claims that they can't back up just for the clicks, I can't in good conscience do that. We have plenty of dark and disturbing facts to go over in this episode without compromising my journalistic integrity, which I value, and is hopefully why you've come to trust me over these years and what sets this show apart from a majority of the conspiracy and cover-up channels and podcasts out there, I hope. But rest assured, there are plenty of things in this episode that will likely shock you, that will directly challenge the official narratives, that will sound too crazy to be true. And for those parts to have meaning, it is important that I give you provable facts wherever possible, that I am clear about times when what I'm saying can be reasonably inferred based on the evidence but not outright proven, and that I'm honest about what the evidence does and doesn't prove, and above all, that I can cleanly separate those layers throughout. I looked into 3 other deaths connected to this group. 2 were hard to make any claims about. Those being the deaths of Detective Joe Riccari, who you may recall was the one Palm Beach PD guy who testified against Epstein, and who was the one pushing for the investigation and spoke with additional victims. The same guy, along with Detective Reeder, who went over the state prosecutor's head and reached out to the FBI to get them involved, because he felt that Kreischer was, quote, in the tank for Epstein, and was trying to minimize the prosecutory efforts. He would pass away fairly suddenly on March 25th of 2018, following what was initially described as a brief illness at the age of 50. More on that in just a sec. The other death was that of Epstein's longtime butler, Alfredo Rodriguez. Between 2004 and 2005, Rodriguez's employment as the house manager for Epstein's Palm Beach estate would come to an end. Sources vary on whether he quit or, I believe, that he was fired. While packing his belongings, Rodriguez got his hands on a 97-page spiral-bound notebook that would come to be known as Epstein's quote-unquote little black book. His extensive list of contacts, in which he had circled the names of people that he felt were most important to Epstein's operation or who, according to him, had quote-unquote crucial information, as well as people that he felt would, quote, have more useful information for the investigators. Side note, do you think that those investigators ever spoke to any of those people that he circled? No, of course they didn't. In the book, there were also stars next to specific entries and arrows pointing towards others, along with at least 38 names that he circled. There doesn't seem to be any sort of official key to decode what it all means, but those markings and his personal annotations have been most widely described as names, addresses, and phone numbers of high-profile people, witnesses, and victims, and overall, they were people that he felt were most connected to the case. Rodriguez would state that he kept the book as insurance because he feared Epstein would, quote, make him disappear, a claim that Epstein allegedly had already made towards him, should he ever talk about what he had witnessed there. He would be directly interviewed by the FBI in 2007 during their original investigation, and demanded that he turn over any evidence that he had in his possession. But Rodriguez would lie and keep the book hidden. In 2009, Rodriguez would attempt to sell the book for $50,000 to civil attorneys representing Epstein's victims, calling it the quote-unquote holy grail of the case. The attorneys would notify authorities and the FBI would spring into action, launching a sting operation. On November 3rd of 2009, an undercover FBI agent posing as a legal associate would meet with Rodriguez, hand him a bag of cash, confiscate the book right before arresting him. In 2012, he would be sentenced to 18 months in prison for obstruction of justice, ironically serving as a longer consecutive sentence than Epstein initially did. To anyone who doubts that we have a two-tiered justice system, I would love to hear you explain that one. In 2015, after it would surface during trial proceedings, a now-defunct website called Gawker would first publish the original redacted Black Book as well as the flight logs. Shortly before Epstein's quote-unquote mysterious death in August of 2019, the unredacted version would pop up floating around in darker corners of the internet, which, yes, is the version that I've included in the research folder for this episode. Rodriguez would also claim to be in possession of what he referred to as the golden ticket, or the other half of the equation, that being a roster of the underage girls who visited Epstein's Palm Beach Pedo Palace. His claim was that Maxwell kept a typed, comprehensive log on her personal computer detailing the visits and scheduling of all the minor girls. Before leaving, he claims to have printed those lists directly from her computer. The list also allegedly held the key to tying the powerful people from the Black Book to the abuse of the underage girls. So the question is, what happened to that list? The FBI would confiscate everything tied to Epstein following the arrest of Rodriguez. Their official stance, as they have repeatedly claimed, is that there is no definitive official quote-unquote client list or separate master log of victims matching Rodriguez's descriptions. None was ever recovered, and that it doesn't exist. The FBI has claimed a lot, though. They claim that he killed himself in prison. They claim there's no client list, no co-conspirators, that he never trafficked victims to anyone, neither did Maxwell, despite them both being charged for trafficking. So if you believe them, then that list never existed, and Epstein and Maxwell only trafficked to one another, or something. I guess it comes down to who you believe. As for Rodriguez, shortly following his release from prison, he would be stricken with a fast-moving and rare aggressive form of cancer called mesothelioma. I'm sure my 90s babies remember the annoying commercials about that, which is, of course, primarily caused by exposure to asbestos. It's unclear exactly where Rodriguez would have been exposed to asbestos, but because of how slow it can be in some cases for symptoms to even develop, it's certainly at least feasible that he was exposed to asbestos in a private job at some point well before all of this, which makes it virtually impossible, or at least journalistically irresponsible, to claim any direct correlation between Epstein, the FBI, and his death, even despite the fact that his death occurred right about the time that the FBI was being pressured into reopening their investigation into Epstein and were reviewing previous interviews and evidence. Correlation doesn't equal causation, weird or not. There's one more death that pops up on the list of deaths tied to Epstein that I want to at least discuss, that being Ruslana Korshinova, or the Russian Rapunzel, as she was frequently called due to her long, beautiful locks. Ruslana had risen from obscurity when Debbie Jones, a booker from Models 1, had noticed her in a feature about her hometown, Almaty, Kazakhstan. 1 year later, when she turned 18 and just before her meteoric rise, she would pop up on a flight manifest for Epstein's Lolita Express taking a trip to his island on June 7th of 2006. The only other confirmed guest on said flight was Epstein, his former UFC fighter bodyguard, his personal chef, his assistant Sarah Kellen, and Stephanie Tidwell. Tidwell is the anomaly of the group. She's only loosely ID'd as an associate in the files, and because there are 2 spelling variations in there and multiple hits on People Finder databases, I couldn't positively ID her. The only email mention was one from Epstein to Leslie Groff telling her to, quote, wire Stephanie Tidwell $500 today. So there is at least a chance that she was just another victim. But since her name appears both on the manifest and contemporary reporting, I'm not exposing her by including her name here. No one knows what took place on that flight or once they arrived on Little St. James, but I do know, at least according to the logs from the return flight, that Ruslana wasn't on it. Meaning that she either stayed behind at the island or she departed on another flight taking a different route. We also know that on the 28th of June 2008, just 4 days before her 21st birthday, witnesses near her apartment on the 9th floor of 130 Water Street in New York's financial district described a sound like a small bomb going off at 2:30 in the afternoon. That sound would turn out to be Ruslana impacting the middle of the street after plummeting nearly 28 feet from her 9th floor balcony. Despite allegedly landing an unusual distance from the building, police would quickly rule her death as being a suicide. Due to her proximity to Epstein, albeit briefly, people were quick to link her death to him or her involvement with his network, which is certainly plausible, I suppose, but that doesn't seem to be where most of the evidence leads. She had been in a string of bad relationships that friends say took a toll on her, as well as feeling lost in her career. She would post on social media 3 months before her death saying, quote, "I'm so lost, will I ever find myself?" Earlier that day, her ex-boyfriend dropped her off at her apartment, shortly after the pair had watched Ghost. A little on the nose there, but okay. Other friends would say that she had just returned from Paris on a modeling job and that she seemed, quote, on top of the world. Her mother doesn't believe that it was self-inflicted, stating that Ruslana told her everything, and that she would have known if she was that depressed, which, sadly, we know isn't always the case with these situations. A British filmmaker named Peter Pomerantsev would produce a documentary on Ruslana's death where he would uncover that she and a friend, Ukrainian-born model Anastasia Drozdova, had attended quote-unquote training sessions at Rose of the World, a Moscow-based cult that is modeled off of LifeSpring, which itself was the subject of multiple lawsuits for mental damages during the 80s. It was a big thing. Look into it if you're curious. Both encouraged members to share their worst experiences and recall repressed memories with a focus on all horrible things that happen to someone or that is done to them as being framed as being their fault. Sessions were described as dark, loud, and disorienting, with a fast-talking quote-unquote trainer meant to overwhelm critical thinking by putting members through intense cycles of shouting, crying, meditation, and dancing. They would also use quote-unquote peak experiences to lure people back for additional training and, of course, for additional fees. She would take part for around 3 months. Anastasia would attend for about a year. Their friends would remark that they seemed noticeably changed following their time there. Ruslana was said to become more aggressive, while Anastasia would reportedly go through violent mood swings. Roughly a year after Ruslana would fall to her death, Anastasia Drozdova would die in Kiev, Ukraine, after also jumping, allegedly, from an apartment building, also from the 9th floor. It's all very disturbing, 2 beautiful young women in the prime of their lives, both passing away in the same manner less than a year apart. Police reporting on Ruslana also states that shortly before she, allegedly, you'll hear that word a lot during this final chapter, jumped from her balcony, she or someone had, quote-unquote, hastily cut off all of her hair. For a model whose entire image was closely tied to her long hair, earning her the nickname the Russian Rapunzel, chopping all of it off could have been a testament to the mental anguish that she was going through and a desire to seize control over at least one aspect of her life, perhaps the same thing that drove her to jump, the desire to control at least her death. I wasn't able to find any statements regarding if police or anyone else ever saw what happened to her hair or if it was ever discovered anywhere. I was specifically looking for that because it could potentially give us a small insight into the timeline and what else was going on. The ex-boyfriend who dropped her off didn't mention her having cut it a few hours earlier. It's really only referenced in reporting, quoting a witness, possibly the ex or her then-boyfriend, who said that it was much shorter than it had been earlier in the night, and a statement from the Moscow morgue where her body was sent to that stated her hair was, quote, in poor condition, as if someone had chopped it off hastily with scissors. As for if her death had any connection to Epstein, based on the available evidence, it's pretty hard to make that claim, at least not directly. It's always possible that abuse that she may have experienced, or even things that she may have seen take place on that island, could have theoretically added to her mental state, but from what I have been able to dig up about it, there is no strong, direct line of evidence tying her seemingly brief association with Epstein to her untimely death. That doesn't mean that her death was a cut-and-dry suicide either, though, because one detail that I mentioned has always stood out to me, and I never found any satisfactory explanation for it, that being where she landed. The distance from the building and her point of impact in the middle of the street was roughly 28 feet, virtually the same, oddly enough, as the distance of her fall, and much further than one could get if they simply climbed over the balcony railing and leapt off. With the height of the railing and the height of the ceiling over the balcony, even being able to get a running start and threading that gap perfectly would be extremely difficult, and likely still wouldn't provide enough distance to get her there. Even if someone or possibly 2 people were to throw her off the balcony, it would still take a pretty good toss to get her there. Does it prove anything though? Not really. Regardless what happened on that day, which we may never fully understand, her tragic death is worth mentioning, and it's yet another reminder of the very steep human cost that was paid by similar victims in Epstein and Brunel's victim model pipeline. Before I close out this chapter, it may be worth just mentioning that Efrain Reyes, Epstein's final cellmate, would have one last meeting with federal investigators to discuss circumstances of Epstein's death towards the end of 2020. Just a few weeks later, he would pass away at 51 years old, supposedly from COVID. Chapter 16. Prelude, Redux, Bookends of Death. On March 6, 1985, it was a gray and chilly morning in Columbus, Ohio. At the Union Cemetery parking lot, a red BMW sat alone while the world around it was still half asleep. Frost still clung to the grass in that way that it makes the ground feel crunchy, and the air carried that damp, late winter silence that makes every sound carry just a little bit further and feel a little sharper than it should. Sitting inside of that red BMW was one of the most powerful attorneys in all of Ohio at the time, Arthur Shapiro. Shapiro wasn't just another lawyer. He was the longtime attorney and tax strategist for Leslie Wexner, a man deeply embedded in the financial architecture of Wexner's empire. For years now, Shapiro had moved comfortably through the world of wealth, corporate law, offshore structures, and aggressive tax strategies. He was respected, connected, and by all outward appearances, untouchable. Or at least he was. But by early 1985, federal investigators were circling. The IRS had reportedly been scrutinizing Shapiro over allegations tied to tax evasion and questionable investment shelters, the sort of complex financial vehicles that promise wealthy clients enormous tax write-offs, the kind of financial maneuvering that Epstein would soon come to perfect. But for Shapiro, it was just attracting attention, and federal prosecutors were building pressure. A grand jury loomed ahead, and the very next day, March 7, 1985, Shapiro was scheduled to testify in it. That was tomorrow, though. This morning, Shapiro found himself in a cemetery parking lot, sharing a takeout breakfast with a man that would never be publicly identified, at least not officially. Witnesses would later say that the pair seemed calm at first, even cordial, but minutes later Shapiro would be fleeing from his own car, and his companion would be described by witnesses as dressed in all black and with a broad brim hat, and running along with a limp would be in close pursuit. The man would fire 2 shots as they crossed the parking lot. One would graze Shapiro's arm, another would graze his hip. Shapiro would make it to a nearby condo complex and began pounding on the first door to be let in. His attacker in all black would catch up before that could happen, though, firing 2 more shots into his head at point-blank range. Fast, precise. Witnesses would describe the attack as cold and professional-like, less like a robbery and more like an assignment. After completing the hit, the killer would rush back to Shapiro's car and drive off in it. It would later be found in a mall parking lot, completely wiped clean of all prints. The investigation into the killing would go nowhere. Investigators publicly treated it as a targeted homicide, but the deeper implications lingered beneath the headlines, because Arthur Shapiro didn't exist in isolation. His client list intersected with immense money and influence. His work touched complex tax structures, elite networks, and financial relationships that outsiders rarely get to see clearly. And now, at the exact moment federal scrutiny threatened to expose it, he was dead, and with him gone, so was the wider case into those operations. Officially, his murder went unsolved, and no definitive public explanation ever arrived. Local authorities did have a suspicion that fellow Columbus area tax accountant Barry L. Kessler may have been involved in ordering the hit, but nothing was ever proven. 6 years later, Kessler would be charged in Florida with arranging the murder of a business partner named John DeRue. He would be convicted in '94 and died in prison in '05. 1 year after the murder, a few interesting things would take place. One being that Kessler would be convicted, along with 2 co-conspirators, for helping Shapiro file false tax returns. While Shapiro was investigated and set to testify, he was named as an unindicted co-conspirator in the case, which is what his testimony would have revolved around. Not only was a key witness eliminated, and what even the police felt was an organized hit, or a quote-unquote mob-style murder, but Kessler and company would only receive probation and served no prison time. One thing that stood out to me, and I bet you guys probably caught it as well, why was Shapiro only an unindicted co-conspirator? When it was his tax returns, then he filed those on behalf of Wexner. If the feds were planning to flip anyone for a lighter sentence in any other reasonable situation, it would have been Kessler, or the others who only helped. This leads me to wonder if the tax case against Shapiro wasn't entirely set up to squeeze him and get him to testify against others who may have been even bigger targets, or part of a more significant scheme. Why this story is so important to this case is because of what took place later. A Columbus police analyst named Elizabeth Loop would spend 6 years investigating the Shapiro murder. The end product of that investigation would be an 8-page report titled Shapiro Homicide Investigation, Analysis and Hypothesis, which she would then send to the commander of the Intelligence Bureau, Curtis Markham, on June 6 of 91. 5 years later, it would come to light during a corruption investigation into Columbus Police Chief James Jackson that he had immediately suppressed that report before ordering it to be destroyed. He would only receive a slap on the wrist for destroying a public record in the form of a 5-day work suspension. Jackson would claim that he ordered it to be destroyed because the report was, quote, filled with wild speculation about prominent business leaders. That remind anyone else of Franklin? It definitely did me. And that it was, quote, potentially libelous. Lucky for us, a copy of that report would survive the destruction order, and it would be accidentally sent to Bob Fitzrakis, a journalist, attorney, and executive director for the Columbus Institute for Contemporary Journalism. 2 years later, as part of an unrelated public records request, that report would come to be known as the Shapiro Murder Investigation, or File, and a copy of it, like always, is available in the research folder. After reading it, it becomes obvious why it was so explosive, and why that Jackson ordered it to be destroyed. One major reason is likely because it names two of Ohio's wealthiest men, Leslie Wexner and Edward DeBartolo, Sr. There's no mention of Barry Kessler, but John W. Jack Kessler is brought up. While they share a last name and location, I wasn't able to firmly establish any familial links. What I did find was that Jack was the co-founder of the New Albany Company, which, if you recall our chapter on Les Wexner, so was he. They founded it together. Jack Kessler would also go on to be a board member of J.P. Morgan and was actually involved in appointing Jamie Dimon as CEO. Aside from Shapiro managing the account for Wexner's The Limited, he was a partner at the law firm Schwartz, Shapiro, Kelm, and Warren, which represented The Limited. The Schwartz part of that firm was Stanley Schwartz, who would take over The Limited's account after Shapiro's death. He would also become involved in ventures interconnected with Wexner, which is a deep rabbit hole that we really don't have time to go down. Another important thing took place the year after Shapiro's murder. Epstein would enter Wexner's life and begin taking over more and more of his business and handling his taxes and finances, even before he was granted the full power of attorney in 91. Former Ohio Inspector General David Sturtz, who had been gathering evidence on Wexner and Epstein regarding public corruption and bribery, would describe Epstein in no uncertain terms as, quote-unquote, Shapiro's replacement. While there is no confirmed overlap between Epstein and Shapiro, Epstein would fill the same sort of position that Shapiro previously held, and would later dissolve several of the companies that Shapiro's firm had established for Wexner. One of those would be renamed to an entity called Parkview Financial, which would later be involved in 2 real estate deals of Epstein's in New York. So essentially, the financial and corporate infrastructure that Shapiro had helped construct would become the early scaffolding in the construction of Epstein's empire. Epstein would become involved in 87, and as we have discussed previously, he had somehow proven so invaluable to Wexner that within 3 years he had effectively taken near total control of Wexner's finances, assets, properties, and his empire. There's a long and scandalous story behind the New Albany Company, from how they were able to effectively bribe, allegedly, their way into having city policy and zoning laws changed to benefit and even just allow elements of their company's existence, to how, despite clearly violating other state and city laws, there was no action ever taken against the company. Wherever Wexner or his companies went, it seemed the corruption followed. The Shapiro murder file makes strong suggestions that Les Wexner and or his business associates were involved with financing the hit on Shapiro. It also outlines how the name of Shapiro's firm, now called Schwartz, Kelm, Warren, and Rubenstein, was changed within hours of Shapiro's murder, which doesn't seem particularly important to the case, but could potentially indicate at least some degree of foreknowledge. The murder investigation file asserts that, based on the evidence, it appears that Les Wexner had, quote, established contact with associates reputed to be organized crime figures, one of whom was a major investment partner and another was using the Limited's headquarters as a mailing address. Those alleged links come primarily through 2 men, Edward DeBartolo, a real estate developer out of Youngstown, Ohio, who has a well-known history of business and investment partnerships with Lex Wexner, and Francis J. Frank Walsh, who was the owner and chief executive officer of Walsh Trading Company out of New Jersey, which has been and still was at the time the primary transporter for the Limited in Columbus. In July of 1984, Walsh was being investigated by the New York Organized Crime Task Force. It goes on to say that, quote, both men have been identified as associates of the Genovese/La Rocca crime family. The ultimate hypothesis, after detailing some potentially illegal business between Wexner, Kessler, Schwartz, a city councilman and jazz club owner named Terry Hammond, and the previously mentioned organized crime connections, is that Arthur Shapiro could have answered too many important questions and, quote, might have been forced to answer them in the impending grand jury hearing. The report concludes with the following paragraph, quote, while the motive for the Shapiro homicide remains unclear, the suspect is an individual who A, knew Shapiro and had some personal/professional contact with him, B, would benefit from his death or by ensuring his silence, C, had close contact with LCN figures or trusted LCN associates, and D, had the personal financial resources to afford the cost of the LCN contract or hit. Now, does this prove that Wexner and or his associates were involved behind the hit on Shapiro? No, and for legal reasons, I'm not even suggesting that. But it does at least suggest that Wexner and co. were, to some extent, involved with known mob figures, likely had the motive, the financial means to pay for it, and quite possibly the legal and city law enforcement connections to do so and get away with it. And while we think of Wexner as the friendly grandfather that naively said a little too much during his recent interview, and was taken advantage of by Epstein, while he was just some clueless, helpless old man the entire time, people more familiar with the history of Wexner, however, tend to see him much differently, because Wexner was, allegedly, mob-affiliated and involved in several scandals before Epstein even ever crossed his path. His unquestionable connections with DiBartolo and DiBartolo's deep connections with the Genovese crime family puts Wexner near to a nexus of gun-running, money laundering, narcotics trafficking, and murder-for-hire plots, and other organized crime-related activities. All things DiBartolo was connected to, according to a 1981 report from U.S. Customs Service Special Agent William F. Burda, who asserted that DiBartolo was connected through Florida-based banks, that DiBartolo had controlling interest in, and that his part of his empire, the part based in Florida, had reported ties to Carlos Moncello, Santos Traficante, and Mayor Lansky, all, of course, well-known mob figures who we have spoke of in previous seasons. DiBartolo also had deep financial ties to World Finance Corporation, a Miami-based international banking firm founded in 1971 by a Cuban exile, and in 1975 DiBartolo would purchase a majority stake in the Metropolitan Bank and Trust Company in Tampa. In 1979, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement would discover that the WFC Corporation was routing its illicit funds and questionable loans from a Grand Cayman subsidiary directly through DiBartolo's Metropolitan Bank. That customs report explicitly alleged that DiBartolo's Florida banks were operating money laundering schemes tied to the mob. The Florida law enforcement report stated that, quote, the WFC Corporation is a cover for the largest narcotics operation in the world. Funny, I thought that was the CIA. So, in summary, the WFC Corp was a massive mafia-influenced narcotics and money laundering machine. Edward DiBartolo, technically senior, but it comes and goes in contemporary reporting, allegedly provided the critical banking pipeline used to move WFC's money, while Leslie Wexner maintained a tight elite business partnership with DiBartolo in Ohio, intertwining the financial empires of America's wealthiest men with the shadows of organized crime. The police report also notes that this broader financial network, which utilized a series of quote-unquote paper corporations to obfuscate footprints, directly preceded Jeffrey Epstein taking over as Wexner's top money manager with power of attorney in the late 80s. DiBartolo took over the, quote, financial wizard of organized crime mantle that Mayor Lansky had previously considered to be. Lansky, according to extensive reporting by Whitney Webb and others, was a key figure in bringing together the alliance between organized crime and intelligence agencies, which would later give rise to Epstein and his sexual blackmail operations. All of this and much more makes naming Wexner as clearly one of Epstein's co-conspirators in his operation arguably the most significant figure in the construction of Epstein's empire, and dirty before Epstein ever even entered his life, really a no-brainer. Then there is a death that took place at the end of Epstein's story that bears mentioning. He was a banker of his named Thomas Bowers, and like Brunel and Epstein, he too would have his death attributed to suicide by hanging. 3 months after Epstein's death, one of Bowers' adult children would approach a house that Bowers had been leasing in Malibu, California, and saw Bowers hanging on a terrace at the Point Dume property. Bowers was not a side character in all of this either. As the head of Deutsche Bank's U.S. Private Wealth Management Division, he was the executive that was over the private wealth management when Epstein was moving all of those suspicious transactions through the bank. And he also signed off on hundreds of millions of dollars in loans to him as well, and would be embroiled in a scandal involving loans to Trump when he was found dead. Bowers had that same position at Citigroup previously as well, where he had also approved Epstein's loans. When Bowers moved over to Deutsche Bank, Epstein would shift his accounts there as well. Banking sources would tell reporters that Bowers had also visited Epstein on his island at least once, as well as his New York mansion of a townhouse. According to the New York Times, under his leadership, Deutsche Bank agreed in 2005 to lend Mr. Trump more than $500 million. This was to build a skyscraper in Chicago. Banker Rosemary Vrablic was assigned to Trump's portfolio, and her direct boss was Bowers. There would be a falling out between Trump and the bank in 2008 when Trump was reportedly unable to pay back the $500 million loan, or just refused to. There's a long and windy history between Trump continuing to get loans from Deutsche Bank even after most all other financial institutions had started refusing to deal with him due to his history of defaults and bankruptcies. And even after defaulting on their loans, Vrablic was introduced to Trump by another of their clients and his recently acquired son-in-law, Jared Kushner. She would help Trump secure a loan from the Private Wealth Management Division to pay down another loan to its investment banking division, all while seeking another loan to purchase the Doral Golf and Spa. Her influence with the bank allowed her to effectively bypass management layers to report directly to Bowers. More on the Dawn later, though. For now, let's get back to Bowers and Epstein. The actual timing of Bowers' death is what makes it most significant. Shortly before, the FBI had subpoenaed Deutsche Bank in May of 2019 for records on all accounts related to Epstein. Federal investigators wanted to interview Bowers regarding the loans that he had approved and the documents that he had overseen. Within weeks of receiving the subpoenas, Deutsche Bank would close all of Epstein's accounts. Questions remain regarding who authorized the relationship with Epstein, despite suspicious activity reports from J.P. Morgan flagging Epstein as high risk, and who overrode the compliance warnings, both roads that led directly to Bowers. Interestingly enough, Bowers wasn't even the only banker connected to all of this to die by supposed suicide. He isn't even the only Deutsche Bank exec, or the only one to supposedly do so by hanging. Back in 2014, William Broeksmit, another Deutsche Bank executive with reported links to the bank's Russian side of operations, was found hanging from a dog leash at his London home. His son, Val Broeksmit, would later turn over a bounty of internal Deutsche Bank documents to journalists as well as the FBI, documents that would expose and make sense of the bank's entanglement with both Russian oligarchs and the Trump Organization. This is one other supposed death by hanging that was ruled a suicide, and it was also someone entrenched into the Epstein class, and this segment of operations that overlapped with heads of state and current and former U.S. presidents. But this time, it's on the Clinton side of the spectrum. You know, the side that always makes my booty hole pucker when I need to talk about it even a little bit. I do feel, however, that this death may provide a deeper insight into how this same suicided method seems to pop up so often around certain groups of people, particularly when someone might know a bit too much and outlives their usefulness. This is the story of the death of Mark Middleton. The rain had already started by the time they found the body, 30 miles away from his home near the isolated grounds of Heifer Ranch in Perryville, Arkansas. A grounds worker came across a scene so grotesque that it barely sounded real when the first reports filtered out. Hanging from a tree by an extension cord was the body of Mark Middleton, former White House aide, longtime Arkansas insider, and one of the most well-connected political fixers in the Clinton orbit. And according to the sheriff's report, there was something else that stood out, a shotgun blast to the chest. This was May 7th of 2022, and the details spread almost immediately online because they sounded impossible. A man found hung by a tree after apparently fatally shooting himself in the chest with a shotgun. Questions exploded before authorities had even finalized the investigation. How could someone hang themselves after firing that fatal shot? Why was there reportedly no weapon immediately visible in the site anywhere around him during the first public descriptions of the crime scene? And, for me at least, why did the story of Middleton's death seem to change depending on which report you read? Mark Middleton wasn't just another former staffer. In the 1990s, Middleton served inside the Clinton White House as a special assistant to the president, and his connection to the Epstein network was well documented. White House visitor logs bearing his name as the one authorizing at least 7 of the 17 or more visits that Epstein made to the Clinton White House between 93 and 95. His name was also tied to other controversies across the administration, including reporting surrounding visits by figures connected to international business interests. Middleton was, by all accounts, a trusted Arkansas loyalist who had climbed into the inner machinery of power during one of the most controversial and turbulent political eras in modern American history. After leaving the White House, he had been placed under investigation for allegedly abusing his access to impress his private business clients, and was barred from future access to the executive mansion without getting senior approval first. A source would later tell the Daily Mail in an article published May 13th, shortly after his death, that, quote, Mark knew that Epstein was managing the money of Les Wexner, and that he saw Epstein as a conduit to major Democratic donors. He would also fly with Epstein on his Lolita Express on at least one occasion in May of 1994. Despite the highly questionable circumstances of Middleton's death, it too would, unsurprisingly, be ruled as a suicide. Middleton's business dealings in Arkansas and the investigations tied to them is a story for another episode. One that I've had planned actually for a long time, but I likely won't release until I guess I feel like I've accomplished all that I need to in this life, to be frank. Look, it's important to be clear about what these deaths mean and what the evidence does and doesn't say. There is no smoking gun proof that any of these deaths were connected in any sort of way. I do feel it is worth noting, at least, though, the patterns and the sheer number of witnesses and potential cohorts that have died, many before they could testify, including Epstein and Brunel, is at very least highly suspicious. There are a lot of people who were in some way caught up with Epstein and his network, who met with an early grave, and many in the same sort of suspicious manner. That alone proves nothing, at least not yet, not officially, but they do make for compelling footnotes in the story of Epstein, a story that seems to never stop evolving or offering new surprises. Chapter 17, The Rabbit Holes We Were Never Meant to Find. And I want to jump in here real quick and just say it literally just started storming here, so very appropriate timing. You may hear that in the background. The Epstein story created a unique kind of paranoia, because unlike some of the wilder conspiracies out there, elements of these suspicions were absolutely real. The private island where the so-called elites would traffic children to be abused, real. The vast trafficking network among them, real. The compromat allegations, also real. The intelligence connections, I feel that I've already largely proven, and there is still more to come, but already those connections were real enough that even former officials openly discussed them. So, understandably, as coded language and whispers of far darker affairs began to bubble up to the surface, people began to ask another reasonable question. If this much was hidden in plain sight, what else was buried beneath it all? And just how far do those darker rabbit holes really go? Let's start off with what was really going on out at Zorro Ranch. It's safe to say, and more proof to the fact emerges all the time, that Jeffrey Epstein was obsessed with transhumanism, a philosophical and scientific movement that advocates for advanced technologies like genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and nanotechnology to fundamentally enhance our species and propel us beyond our biological limitations. It is a preferred topic of tech bros and people like Epstein, who 60 years ago would have been considered an advocate for eugenics. In 2019, the New York Times would report that Epstein had confided to scientists within his orbit that his intention was to, quote, seed the human race with his DNA by impregnating women at his vast New Mexico ranch. While the Times would also note that there was, quote, no evidence his scheme ever came to fruition, evidence exists to the contrary. One of the most heartbreaking pieces of that evidence came to us in the form of a personal diary in the files, which were released from an alleged victim within a 2-rail fence cipher to disguise her words, presumably from Epstein and Maxwell, and that also includes magazine clippings and other scrapbook-style page segments. The full diary is in the folder, but I will summarize it here for you. Just know that the full diary in her words is even more heartbreaking. On the first page, she describes wishing that she had closed her eyes faster, a decision that was made, but she couldn't tell Jeffrey. She mentions it was a new doctor this time, and she thinks they're from Israel. There was a shot administered, and rod-like things that had a hook. So much pain. Actually, I'll just read this first page, but please be advised what she says may cause discomfort for some of you, and could potentially be a trauma trigger. So if you feel that it is, or that it could be, and it's in your best interest to do so, please feel free to skip this section completely. Close your eyes, close your eyes, close your eyes. Don't speak, she doesn't talk. I can't stop shaking and it's been a week. A decision was made, but I can't tell Jeffrey. These things happen. Why didn't I close my eyes fast enough? The doctor was different again. I think from Israel. He had kind eyes, but didn't speak directly to me. This was different. A shot and those rod-like things had a hook and so much pain. Ghislaine said to push all the pain away. I don't understand. Blood and water all over the bed, and she was right. Like a feeling when your tummy hurts and you have to push. She said to close my eyes and put her hands over my eyes, but I didn't close them because of these tiny cries. I am so lost. I saw between her fingers this tiny head and body in the doctor's hands. It reached its tiny arm and had a tiny foot. I closed my eyes and no more. And then I'll read another part from page 3 of this diary real quick. Cries, I don't understand. Just say these things happen, but he doesn't believe that. They yelled and screamed, and he said that it will be the same in a couple of months, and she said that she was fed up with it all. I don't understand what is going on, and no one will tell me. I can't go to school like this. I can't stop shaking. Why won't anyone make it stop? I know Ghislaine is trying, but nothing changes. Why didn't I close my eyes? So, as you just heard, at least according to this victim, who I believe for multiple reasons, there were at least some examples of those DNA seeding / eugenics experiments that were actually taking place. Girls who matched the look and had the desirable genetic traits that he was looking for, or perhaps, as she even questions at one point, were from particularly desirable bloodlines, were being used in some sort of baby harvesting operation. What we don't know is whatever became of those babies. There are several theories out there, one being similar to accusations against John of God, the cult leader that was co-signed by Oprah, who allegedly had hundreds of girls who, quote, were enslaved over years, lived on farms in Goyas, and served as wombs to get pregnant for their babies to be sold. This is according to Sabrina Bittencourt, one of his victims. The same allegation is brought up in the Epstein files in relation to Zorro Ranch, where Epstein allegedly asked women and even offered some of them money to do this. When that didn't pan out, it would seem that he just used the power and control that he had over young victims to just do it by force, or at least in the case that we just spoke of. Several victims have described the Zorro as being an abuse hub and the most frightening of his properties. Zorro, much like the island, offered the sort of privacy that easily becomes an inescapable prison. If this is what he planned on doing with the babies, to sell undocumented and thus untraceable infants on the black market, it raises even more questions about why them having certain traits or coming from a quote-unquote superior gene pool, and also being disseminated by Epstein was so important. While those sort of black market sales do, unfortunately, take place, this seems bigger than that. There were also situations where these young victims would end up pregnant by other associates of Epstein's, yet they were made to have abortions when he just as easily, in many cases I'm sure, could have taken that child and sold it had that been the goal. The New York Times in their reporting mentioned that he stated his intention at one point was to, quote, strengthen the gene pool. Testimony of one of the victims in the trial of Keith Raniere of the whole, Nixon, how do you say that word, the sex cult in Hollywood, revealed that Raniere had similar plans to spread his DNA as part of the cult's goals. And there's been quite a bit of examining this phenomenon by psychologists who often conclude it is largely about power and control, two things that we know Epstein had and desired endlessly. But is that the whole story? Several Epstein & Co. victims also describe being drugged and waking up in unfamiliar places, with at least one stating that she woke up in a medical-type room, feeling that something had been done to her, but unsure of what it was. Another victim, identified as Juliet Bryant, spoke in an interview with Chris Hansen describing being at the Zorro Ranch and being drugged and waking up in a lab. She describes that, quote, there were people working on me, and it wasn't like a usual sort of hospital area. It was just, there's something very weird that happened. I don't know what it is. They did something serious to me. And I know they did because I've abused myself many times in my life, but I've never felt as bad as I did when I came back from that place. So I wish I knew the truth, but if I did know more, I'd probably be dead. They probably want me dead already. I can't go out. I can't even go to the beach. I've been followed. Going on to say, quote, I had no problem going out as a young girl in Cape Town, but now I can't go out because my tires get slashed. As we discussed before, his Zorro Ranch main compound was constructed by Bradbury Stam Construction, who don't build houses, they build mostly classified facilities. It is absolutely an underground complex of some sort beneath the Zorro. It was also the only property of Epstein's that wasn't raided following his arrest. In fact, it wouldn't even be searched until March 9th of this year. And that was only done then because the New Mexico Attorney General, Raul Torres, reopened the state's criminal probe based on evidence that was found in the files. A probe that was, by the way, shut down by the feds to supposedly not conflict with their puny 2-count indictment. So, the FBI and DOJ ordered New Mexico to stop their investigation. They never even bothered to search the Zorro Ranch property themselves. If I didn't make it clear there, the current investigation is still ongoing. What the feds made them shut down was the original one that they were looking into prior to the federal case that was brought in 2019. Have we started to see how all of this works yet? How he was allowed to operate for decades largely unchecked? Not only unchecked, but seemingly protected. Might that have had more to do with Epstein taking over Wexner's money as well? There's quite a bit of evidence pointing to Epstein having initially acquired blackmail on Wexner, and that being his true foot inside the door. But you have to wonder how a little guy like Epstein would be able to blackmail these powerful people, especially someone like Wexner who absolutely had mafia connections. The only thing that I can even possibly imagine is that it was made clear that Epstein wasn't to be touched. Possibly for the same reason that Acosta felt that he couldn't fully take him down either. All speculation, of course, just for entertainment purposes and all that, but worth considering before we move on though. Because the next thing that we need to talk about involves signs that also point towards a deeper intelligence connection. Zorro Development Corporation, the legal entity that Epstein used as the holding company for that property, filed 5 FCC microwave licenses to operate a secure point-to-point microwave communication system, one that was modeled on a system he already was using on Little St. Pedo Island. The contractor who worked on the system mentions in an email that it is, quote, military-grade system. He chose this system, the most expensive and difficult one possible out of a list of 2 other options in it, with the other 2 being rated to be much easier to operate and far less expensive. While discussing the proposition with Richard Kahn, his New York-based project coordinator and finance guy, an odd choice to begin with, he made the statement, quote, "We shoot Dragon Wave further, makes little sense." That was what piqued my interest to begin with. Dragon Wave isn't some off-the-shelf equipment that anyone can just go and buy. What we are actually talking about here is carrier-grade technology. They specialize in high-capacity packet microwave and wireless networking solutions. Their main function is supporting microwave and wireless network backhaul, meaning their microwave radios connect cell towers and remote stations to the main telecom network and are capable of extremely high-speed data transfer. It's mostly found in military, intelligence, and upper-level government networks. Its most significant ability is hardware-level AES encryption built into the radio layer below the IP stack, aka totally invisible to standard network monitoring. It's then combined with hardware-bound authentication, making any sort of hacking or intercepting of the signal essentially impossible. When he said, quote, "We shoot Dragon Wave further," he was talking about the system he already had on the island, and basically saying, why can't we just do that here? This was all taking place when the pressure was back on from the Miami Herald expose, and the SDNY began digging back into his child trafficking network, at a time when he was shifting his operation from the island out to Zorro. This backbone of the Zorro system was a microwave link from the main house to the Sandia Crest, a major communications hub above Albuquerque. The company that built that system was Future Technologies Venture, LLC, and much like Bradbury Stam, they are mostly a military-industrial contractor, with the Pentagon being one of their biggest clients. They describe themselves as being specialists in, quote, mission-critical connectivity infrastructure for, quote, extremely remote outdoor sites and government environments. So it seems a bit unlikely that, as we were told, if Epstein was just some pedo who was alleged to have some downloaded CSAM, that he would feel compelled to run his network operation directly through multiple U.S. government proxies, or set up such an absurdly secure and excessively powerful comm system that would almost certainly draw the eyes of the CIA just to, what, have fast internet? There's a company there in Albuquerque called Telebeeper. of New Mexico that hold a satellite Earth station license with direct-to-orbit uplink capability. Same person holding that license, Dennis Vanderhoof, is the same guy who owns the tower on Sandia Crest where Epstein was having a satellite dish placed to receive the signal from Zorro, meaning this wasn't about having good internet at the ranch. This meant that the data transmitted from the ranch would be beamed 27.53 miles via encrypted military-grade microwave signal to Sandia Crest Tower. From there, it would then reach Vanderhoof's satellite Earth station and be beamed to a satellite in orbit, from where it can reach anywhere on Earth and be completely untraceable back to the ranch. Despite that being the method with the lowest bandwidth out of all of his options that he was presented with in the beginning, it did offer something that the others didn't: complete and total privacy with no threat that whatever he needed to send so secretively could ever be intercepted. I doubt that I have to tell this audience that this whole thing has CIA tradecraft written all over it. This is really only one in a series of small clues that point directly back to this being an intelligence op. This element points out how he could have transmitted compromat to anywhere on the planet without risking exposure or having it intercepted. To be honest, I can't even fathom another reason that any private user would have for a system this expensive, secure, and technologically complex. This goes so far beyond any reasonable level of paranoia that it tips hard in the direction of top-secret intel operation, at least in my eyes, especially when you put this together with the other elements that we've already discussed. The breakdown for that, just as a quick reminder, goes something like this. There is a fairly long and well-supported evidentiary trail that connects Epstein to most likely being an asset of the Mossad and likely co-asset of at least the CIA, going all the way back to Ghislaine's father, Robert Maxwell, whose evidence of being an intelligence asset for Israel, and very likely others, as heavily documented. It also bears mentioning that the countries and agencies that he sold the stolen and backdoored Promise software to, one of them was the Sandia National Labs in 1985. And then we have Ghislaine's two sisters, Christine being one of them, who, among other things, was the one responsible for constructing the privacy-destroying post-9/11 data warehouse for the FBI through her company, Chiliad, which is a whole other rabbit hole, trust me. As far as Epstein's Zorro compound, it appears deeply entrenched with U.S. military intelligence, and the contractor behind his crazy satellite encrypted uplink system is now the holder of a contract from the Missile Defense Agency. Possibly this goes all the way back to him being hired by former OSS agent Donald Barr back at Dalton, despite lacking any of the credentials expected of the position. So while there's no single smoking gun document that identifies Epstein as a spy or an asset, and of course there wouldn't be, a great deal can be inferred by following the breadcrumbs. Which brings me to my next point. Over the course of 2 days, July 6th and 7th of 2019, the FBI, with assistance by the NYPD Crimes Against Children Task Force, would execute a raid on Epstein's New York mansion of a townhouse at 9 East 71st Street in the Upper East Side neighborhood of Manhattan. Agents would be seen removing bag after bag of evidence, and reported finding multiple caches of evidence all across the house. Hard drives and bins and drawers, CDs and DVD full of data and video, including the inside of large black binders full of CDs with name labels. Cash, a reported $70,000, was recovered. Loose diamonds, passports, including the fake Saudi passport that we discussed previously, all in a large wall safe that agents had to cut open with a specialized saw. What makes the story feel so eerie, and why it's important to discuss, is that some of the most suggestive material was seen, photographed, or testified about in court proceedings, but never publicly itemized in a way that resolves the obvious question of exactly what was found on those discs. The largest cache of evidence in a single spot was undoubtedly inside the large safe in a fifth-floor dressing room, which contained hard drives, stacks of CDs with labels like important person's name with female age at blank. While the safe was opened during the raid, the contents weren't immediately seized. Agents say that they left the contents in place while seeking a broader warrant that covered things like the contents of locked safes, which supposedly weren't covered under the initial search warrant. They also found those thick black binders of CDs in labeled sleeves with thumbnail images matching files on the disc. Prosecutors would later actually show photos in court of those binders, but with the names blacked out because they identified quote-unquote third parties. Third parties who were never followed up with or charged with anything, mind you. All of this, of course, loudly screams blackmail operation. Here's where the biggest twist comes into play, though. Remember the labeled CDs found in the safe that agents reportedly left behind to seek a wider warrant? Well, when the agents returned with the new warrant, those items were simply gone. gone from a secure crime scene in one of the biggest child trafficking cases ever brought in the U.S. and one that implicated numerous powerful people. I went on a hunt to find those pieces of evidence and came across a deposition of Richard Kahn, Epstein's longtime finance manager and primary accountant guy. According to Kahn, he was contacted by Merwin de la Cruz, the mansion's manager, that he had allegedly packed the safe's contents into 2 large suitcases and left them with Kahn's doorman. Kahn would go on to state that he turned them over to the FBI. The prosecutors, who weren't at the raid, said that the suitcases' contents, quote, appeared to match what had been in the safe. I find this oddly reminiscent of his 2005 case when investigators arrived to conduct the raid. It was very obvious that computers, hard drives, and physical material had been removed before they arrived, items that were never fully recovered. Palm Beach PD officers, namely Detective Joe Brickeri, felt that info regarding the coming raid had been leaked to Epstein in advance, signaling that some sort of inside job was responsible for it, either from within the department or from the prosecutor's office, as he suspected. Although they were supposedly returned by Richard Kahn, there is still no full public catalog of the CDs with labels such as blank with female 14 blank within the release files, nor does it seem to exist according to people with access anywhere on the less redacted SCIF access side. This is despite claims of them possessing them, and them being mentioned extensively in public reporting as well as coming up in court cases, though always redacted, due to them actually naming the elite pedophiles. Third parties, privacy, sorry. I don't know what came over me there. Anyway, there's no mystery of whether or not they exist. It's very well documented that they did. The mystery is over the chain of custody, how complete what was turned over was, the full contents of the drives and disks recovered, and whether or not the evidence was ever properly preserved, cataloged, or analyzed in any way that could ever lead to any sort of accountability. The official narrative is that Kahn had the staff pack them up and bring them to him for quote-unquote safekeeping so that he could turn them over to the FBI. The FBI then claims that all of the safe's contents, including CDs and hard drives, as well as the organized binders full of the data CDs, were then cataloged, analyzed by the FBI's computer analysis response team, and integrated into the federal government's evidence holdings. Their totally transparent findings, which add up to an incredibly unbelievable trust me bro, are as follows. The files contained over 300 gigs of data, or what one of those hard drives could probably hold on its own, of nothing but CSAM and porn. That none of the recovered material, not even the binders or CDs, despite the labels, contained any evidence implicating any third-party abusers or anyone other than Epstein and Maxwell. So let's just stop and think about this for just a second. If they were the only abusers on those CDs, and we know from direct testimony of agents involved how they were labeled, you mean to tell me that they did all of that just to keep writing Epstein or Ghislaine's name on all of them as the abuser? So not only were they supposedly only trafficking to themselves the whole time, they were also only collecting evidence on themselves to presumably what? Blackmail themselves too? That makes zero logical sense at all. The meticulous indexing alone strongly suggests a catalog of specific encounters involving specific individuals that they felt the need to label and record, i.e. precisely how blackmail ops function, classifying material by the identity of the subject and the victim to make it easily retrievable. The audacious claim that no evidence of third-party involvement existed in Epstein's vaults is directly contradicted by other verified pieces of evidence, as well as testimony. Things such as his extensive contact logs, numerous victims, including Virginia Giuffre, testified under oath that they were forced to have sexual encounters and be abused by prominent individuals, and that Epstein explicitly filmed these encounters to use them as quote-unquote insurance or blackmail. Then there's the case of the other missing tapes. During the search of Epstein's Palm Beach mansion, local police and FBI agents noted the presence of elaborate surveillance systems and hidden cameras in multiple guest bedrooms, as well as around the house and gathering areas. It seriously strains credibility to assert that an operation so clearly set up and designed to capture powerful people on camera for decades somehow yielded zero footage of anyone other than Epstein himself and maybe Maxwell. With all of the highly convenient system-wide quote-unquote failures over the years involving Epstein, sorry, but this time a trust me bro from the FBI and DOJ is not going to cut it. From magically skating on a massive Ponzi scheme, though many complaints were never followed up on, through his ridiculous 08 sweetheart deal and all the way through the string of highly unlikely failures that led to his supposed death at the Metropolitan Correctional Center. These people have proven that they can't be trusted. By classifying the contents of the safe strictly as CSAM, the government's created a legal wall that prevents independent verification, because it is a federal crime to duplicate or distribute CSAM, and rightfully so. That means that no independent journalists, outside legal teams, or even congressional committees can view the raw files to verify if the FBI summary is actually accurate. This ensures that the public and even Congress must rely entirely on the words of agencies with a proven track record of mishandling this case and deception. My workaround would have been to submit a FOIA for the evidence, photos of the binders, listings, and CD labels, but you'll never guess why that didn't work. If you said Exemption 6 and 7C, of course. The only way that we can overcome this would be to somehow prove that the public interest in seeing those names somehow outweighs the privacy interest of the individuals named, which doesn't mean that public curiosity or a desire to uncover a cover-up. It very strictly means showing, quote, what the government is up to. That has historically been shut down, though, by the ruling that exposing the identities of private individuals doesn't shed light on the inner workings of a government agency, meaning privacy of names virtually always wins that balancing test. Media outlets did begin trying to expose those labels when news of them broke widely during the 2021 Maxwell trial. During the trial, FBI Special Agent Kelly McGuire was made to testify about his finding of the rows of large black binders filled with CDs and contact sheets on the 5th floor of Epstein's mansion. This would spark certain media outlets to push to view the evidence photos of them. U.S. District Judge Allison Nathan, however, would rule that the quote-unquote homemade labels contained highly sensitive identifying information for third parties and minor victims. No shit, lady. Why do you think people want to see them? The court would end up allowing the public to see the physical binders in photos, but ordered that the labels be completely blacked out. The unredacted versions were restricted strictly to the jury under seal. There's a small glimmer of hope, though. Prior to the EFTA being passed, a foundational lawsuit specifically seeking the FBI's investigative files on Epstein was filed by Radar Online. The FBI would throw every remotely plausible exception that they had in their defense, but would eventually be compelled to release a puny 1,232 pages out of the 11,571 response pages it processed, meaning the FBI successfully withheld almost 90% of those files. While those 1,200 some odd pages were still heavily redacted, an internal document within the FBI would reveal that Epstein had operated as an FBI informant prior to his 2008 non-prosecution agreement. After the EFTA was enacted, a few months later, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals signaled that it was remanding the case back down to the lower court to force the FBI to reevaluate what is legally allowed to withhold under the new, stricter transparency laws. The EFTA would also force that the total amount of data seized was 15 terabytes. For reference, if properly stored, the entirety of the Library of Congress can be stored on 10 terabytes. Anyone who's looked into all of this at any real depth, it quickly becomes blatantly apparent that the FBI and DOJ are abusing the victim privacy clause in the EFTA to conceal the identities of unindicted adult abusers. And that is where we're going to have to stop for today. Next week, we'll be heading deeper underground beneath the island in Zorro to try and suss out what secrets may have been hidden down there. We'll take a look at some of the strange coded language to try and better understand what the seeming obsession with pizza, grape soda, and beef jerky might be. We'll dig deeper into the blackmail racket and how Epstein truly began, trace how deep his connection to the Rothschilds actually was a bit further, and do what so few others seem willing to do: name names. We still have a lot left to expose, the extent and legacy of this network to unravel, and an ending that even I never quite saw coming. But for now, do me a quick favor. If you've enjoyed the series so far, you support my work in general, throw us a like if you're watching this on YouTube, or leave a comment or a review if you're listening to this on Spotify or iTunes or any of those. Be sure to check out the Patreon. I'll be posting the full research folder, link and everything over there. And that's for all members, including the free tier. You don't have to pay anything to get access to a lot of extra stuff. As well as in the Discord, for anybody that wants to find that link and meet me over there whenever the final part does drop. And above all, come back same time next week for the final conclusion. Until then, take care of yourselves out there. Take care of one another whenever you can. And I'll talk to you all again real soon on the next Clandestine Radio.